and welcome to my channel Computer Classes by Rachna. On request of students for Unit 4 explanation, we are doing normalization. So I'll take a very simple example for normalization. Suppose we have three normal forms. We already know the first normal form, second normal form, and third normal form. So we will be given some table and we have to convert them into normal forms. We have to normalize the table. So what are the basic criteria for first normal form? In the first normal form, a single cell must hold only one value. So there should be atomic values. For example, if there is a table and within that table, for every intersection of row and column, we should have only one single value. In these cells, we should have one single value. If there is some multi-valued attribute, then it must be converted into the single value attribute. For example, if let's say we have a department ID and we have department location, and let's say there are multiple locations, so department number 1 have location in Chicago also, and it also have location in India. So it is having two values. We have to divide it into two rows, so one Chicago and one for India. That ways we will convert it into first normal form. So if there is a table with multiple values, we must convert it into atomic values, and there must be a primary key in the table for identification, and no duplication of rows and columns, in the sense that for all the rows that we have been using, all the rows should be unique. They should not be having multiple columns and rows repeating, and each column must have only one value for each row in the table, which means atomicity. Then the second normal form, it eliminates the repeating groups, and a table must be in first normal form for this to be in second normal form, and there should not be partial dependency. What is the meaning of partial dependency? That if we have a combination of primary key, which is for key 1 and key 2, then all the non-prime attributes should depend completely on this combined key. There should not be the case that this simple key can determine the other values also. Single key can determine the other values. So it will be more clear through the example. Then we have the third normal form. In third normal form, there should not be partial transitive dependency, which means if I have one key determining the value of another key, so if K1 is determining the value of K2 and K2 is determining the value of K3, then the values of K1, K2 and K3 columns should not be in the same table. We should divide the table so that K1 determines K2 and K2 determines K3 should be part of another table. So this should be part of one table and this should be part of another table. This is allowed only in one case, when this is a candidate key, which means in third normal form, if I have, let's say, roll number determines the admission number, and admission number determines the course. So roll number can also determine the course and admission number can also determine the course. Since roll number and admission number are candidate keys, so it is allowed. If it is a candidate key, it can be allowed, otherwise it is not allowed. And then we also have a Boy's code normal form. In Boy's code normal form, even this is not allowed, that candidate key can be used. All right, so these are the restrictions for normal forms. Now we move further with this example. Suppose we have this example. In this table we have employee ID, name, job code, job, and state code and home state. So these are the attributes in one single table, where we imagine that it's a restaurant management application. It need to store the data about company employees, and we need to normalize this table. Now we can assume that let's say employee ID is the primary key. If we assume that there's a single primary key, even then, so employee ID can determine with the help of employee ID, we can determine the name of the employee. with the help of employee ID we can determine the job code of the employee. But we if we know the job code, then we do not need to have the um, employee ID and job at the same place, because job code can determine the job. All right. And then if we talk about the state code, the employee ID can determine the state code of the employee, but state depends on the state code itself, home state. We do not need to have all these values in one single table, so we can divide them further. And also we check if there are any values which are repeating. So you can see here that these values are repeating. We are having employee ID 1 Alice, again employee ID 1 as Alice, employee ID 2 as Bob, and employee ID 3 as Alice. So these two values are repeating at two places. So we will divide it into a second normal form. So we can divide it as employee ID 1, um employee ID and employee name, state, and home state. So here we are having employee ID, employee IDs as 123 E001 002 along with their name, their state code, and their home state. And we have the second value which is related to the job. So this particular employee ID 1 can perform two jobs. It can also perform job 01, 02. Employee ID 2 can also perform job 02 and 03, and employee ID 3 is performing the job 01. So we have divided it here into two columns. One is the employee ID, another is the job code. All right. So this is one table that we are forming. This is the second table then we are forming, and then the third table that we are forming is the jobs table. So the jobs table, we are having the job code and the job itself. So now we see that even in this is the table where we are not having the repeating groups now. So we have one group of employee ID and job code, we have another group of employee ID, name, state, and home state, and we have another group which is job code and job. So these become the primary key of the segregated table. So now these become the primary key. Now we check for the third normal form. This is the second normal form. Now we check for the third normal form, which is there should not be any transitive dependency, in the sense that employee ID determines name, that's correct. Employee ID determines state, that is also correct. But employee ID determines home state, no. This state code determines the home state. So this is a transitive dependency, and the state code is not a candidate key for employee ID. So we need to remove this transitive dependency. So we will separate it into two tables. One would be this and one would be this. So after getting things into second normal form, we will have the tables divided further. So this would become the first table. Employee ID, name, and state code will become the second table, and then jobs table will become the third table, and states table will become the fourth table. Now our database is in third normal form. So what is the criteria? The first criteria is atomic values for every intersection of row and column, no multiple values in first normal form. The second criteria is that there should not be any partial dependency. All the values that we are using should be completely dependent on the primary key. If there are values which are not completely dependent on the primary key, they can also be determined from a non-primary key, then they should form a separate table. Then, so which means no partial dependencies, no partial dependencies. And the third normal form means no transitive dependencies. There should not be any transitive dependency. All right. So in the first normal form, we saw, again I'm telling you why we separated this table. We saw that name is completely dependent on employee name, but job code is completely dependent on employee ID. But job is not completely dependent on employee ID. We can understand that job is dependent on the job code. State code is dependent on the employee ID, correct? But home state is not dependent on this. So we have to separate out things. We have to separate out them into table, because the non-prime attributes, what are the non-prime attributes? Which are not the primary key. So if we say these are the non-prime attributes, they should be dependent on the primary key, but they were not dependent on the primary key, they were dependent on other keys also. So that's why we separated them into separate tables. All right, so this is the reason why we had to separate the table to normalize it. I hope you have understood now. So what is first normal form, second normal form, and third normal form? The Boyce Codd normal form is a stricter form of third normal form. So and I have already shared and explained the notes of fourth and fifth normal form in the other lectures. So I hope you understood the normalization. Kindly like the video if you have understood. Thank you so much.